From 1936 to 1940, the French Army's high command ran countless war games, simulating paths to victory in a future conflict with Germany. But in the summer of 1940, all those plans were shattered by the Sickle-Cut Offensive. Still, the formidable Eastern defensive line did exist, and it was never truly breached. By the time the Franco-German armistice was signed on June 25th, the German army had only destroyed or captured 5 small fortress complexes and had broken through in the undefended Sarre Gap and the lightly fortified Vosges Mountains. The main body of the line remained intact. André Maginot, the former Minister of War who died of typhoid fever in 1932, had reason to be proud of his creation. It was he who persuaded the National Assembly in 1929, a time of relative prosperity, to allocate 3.3 billion francs for this masterpiece of military engineering, which took nearly a decade to build. It was named the Maginot Line to honor the World War I veteran who had spent his childhood in Alsace-Lorraine and now built an iron wall to protect it. Even into the 1950s, the surviving French army was still repairing and reinforcing the remaining sections of the Maginot Line, hoping to deter a potential westward advance by the Soviet Union. From another perspective, however, the Maginot Line was never the first choice for France's military and political leaders. In the early 1920s, they had proactively explored the possibility of a preemptive strike to destroy Germany's core industrial regions and prioritized military alliances with Belgium and Eastern European nations. Successive French governments were the most loyal defenders of the League of Nations Treaty and the collective security system, recognizing Germany's aggressive ambitions far earlier than Great Britain. Even in the mid to late 1930s, as the mood of appeasement swept across Europe, France was still prepared to advance its most capable army units into Belgium and launch a determined offensive against Germany. Much of the harsh criticism leveled by British and American historians, like B. H. Liddell Hart, against France's pre-war military strategy and defense policy is not entirely based on fact. Yet France had few better options. The devastation of World War I and France's demographic weaknesses made it impossible to bear the long-term financial and social costs of maintaining an offensive-minded army. The collapse of Europe's collective security system coincided with the Great Depression of the 1930s. This dual crisis undermined the offensive and defensive strategies that had been meticulously planned in the first decade after the war and left France unable to stand alone against Hitler's might, forcing it into heavy reliance on the will of its British allies. In this context, a purely defensive strategy, originally a suboptimal choice, and its physical embodiment, the Maginot Line, unexpectedly became the only reliable strategic tool available in 1940. On November 11, 1918, 4 brutal years of World War finally came to an end. As one of the main victors, France enjoyed a long-absent international prestige and glory. But the price it paid was staggering. 1.397 million soldiers were killed, more than the total strength of the French army at the start of the war. Another 700,000 civilians died from combat, famine, and disease. The combined total amounted to 4.39% of the country's population. Another 4.266 million military personnel and civilians were wounded to varying degrees, with over a third suffering permanent disabilities. With its core industrial zones ravaged by the German invasion, France's 1919 industrial output was only 57% of its 1913 level. Public facilities and means of production worth 134 billion francs were destroyed, and government debt soared to 1.7 times the annual GDP. Well into the mid-1930s, the government was still allocating nearly half of its annual budget to repaying war debts and paying pensions to the families of the fallen. France retained the most powerful land army in Western Europe, but its overall strength was in rapid decline. Fortunately, in the first decade after the war, France experienced an economic recovery and was able to rethink its defense strategy. Under the center-right coalition government led by Raymond Poincaré, France eased its financial difficulties by increasing taxes and stabilizing its currency, and production began to recover. However, a dark cloud always loomed over France: the threat of its old enemy to the east, Germany. For a financially burdened France, the failure to secure German reparations directly impacted the budget for modernizing the army's frontline equipment. Making matters worse, due to its disadvantages in population size and growth rate, France had no hope of winning an arms race with a rearmed Germany if their equipment was on the same level. At the end of 1918, the population ratio of France to Germany was 39 million to 63 million, and the ratio of men aged 20 to 34 prime candidates for frontline soldiers was 1 to 1.7. With nearly 30% of its young men killed in the war, France's population growth stagnated for 20 years after the armistice, increasing by a mere 540,000. By 1939, the number of draft-age men aged 20 to 34 in France and Germany was 4 million versus 9 million. Without foresight and planning, France's defeat was almost a certainty. Thus, the discussions on France's new defense plan, which began in 1920, turned into a profound debate with implications far beyond the military. It touched on France's structural weaknesses in population and industrial capacity, its just recovering finances, and the fresh lessons of the Great War. The Supreme War Council quickly split into two camps: Marshal Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander at the armistice, and Edmund Buet, the new chief of the army staff, advocated for offense. Marshal Joffre, the hero of the 1914 Battle of the Marne, and Marshal Pétain, the council's vice-chairman, argued for defense. This debate lasted for nearly 7 years and drew in almost all of France's mid to senior level officers. By around 1927, the defensive school of thought finally gained the upper hand. The army established a special border defense committee to meticulously discuss and design the final form of the defensive line. André Maginot, the Minister of War and a longtime follower of Joffre, made a passionate speech to the National Assembly, persuading the deputies to pass the 3.3 billion franc budget with an overwhelming majority. In 1928, civil engineering work began in Alsace-Lorraine and along the Alpine border, and the following year it was extended to northern France. This unparalleled defensive line was born. Strictly speaking, there were two versions of the Maginot Line. In a broad sense, it was a continuous border defense line stretching from Dunkirk at the end of the Franco-Belgian border in the north to Nice on the Franco-Italian border in the south, covering the entire land borders with Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. In a narrow sense, it referred to the 242-mile, 390 kilometers northeastern front line, starting from Longuyon, about 31 miles 50 kilometers northwest of Metz, circling the Alsace-Lorraine salient along the Rhine, and ending near Belfort, close to the Swiss border. Unlike a conventional line, the Maginot Line was essentially a deep, massive firepower network. Located 36 miles 10 kilometers behind the border, some core sections had a depth of over 12 miles 20 kilometers. It was connected by 280 miles 450 kilometers of roads and involved excavating 12 million cubic meters of earth, using 1.5 million cubic meters of concrete and 150,000 tons of steel. The very front of each line section featured a series of observation posts and small pillboxes. This was followed by multiple rows of anti-tank obstacles made from railway tracks, set 36 miles 10 kilometers deep. Behind these lay the main defensive works, consisting of retractable turrets and fortress complexes. The turret, a semi-submerged fortification made of a double reinforced concrete casemate, was the most important defensive fire platform along the entire line. Its inner walls were about 3 feet 1 m thick, and the outer walls were covered with over 6.5 feet 2 m of reinforced concrete, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a 240mm shell. Each turret could house a garrison of 15 to 30 men and had 2 to 4 firing ports in various directions, which could be fitted with single or twin machine guns, 25mm anti-tank guns, or 50mm mortars as needed. Each turret was protected by a 10-foot deep 3M trench, had 1 to 3 steel domed cupolas and searchlights on top, and featured an independent ventilation system to protect against poison gas. Spaced among the 352 turrets were 142 larger fortress complexes, known as ouvrages. Their purpose was to provide fire support over a wider front and to command and execute counterattacks in key sectors. A small fortress petit ouvrage typically consisted of 2 connected semi-submerged turrets and an infantry casemate. The turrets were armed with a twin 7.5mm machine gun and a light anti-tank gun, respectively. The casemate, in addition to a twin machine gun, also housed a 50mm mortar or a 75mm infantry gun. The tops of all small fortresses were covered with 8 feet 2.5 m of concrete, extended more than 65 feet 20 m underground, and had turret walls plated with 12 inches 30 centimeters of steel. They stored enough provisions to theoretically allow 150 officers and men to hold out for a month. The large fortresses Gros Ouvrages were the largest and most complex fortifications on the entire line. Due to their extremely high construction cost, only 22 were built, even in the core sectors. Most large fortresses were constructed inside hollowed-out hills, with the exposed tops covered by 11.5 feet 3.5 m of reinforced concrete, theoretically able to withstand a hit from a 420 mm super heavy mortar. Each consisted of over a dozen semi-submerged turrets, infantry casemates, artillery casemates, and observation posts of various sizes, all connected by deep underground tunnels. The most prominent feature of the large fortresses compared to the smaller ones was their independent howitzer turrets, armed with 81 mm mortars, 135 mm short-barreled howitzers, and 75 mm cannon howitzers. Each had its own ammunition hoist and elevator, with a maximum ammunition capacity of 1,000–2,000 rounds per turret. Although their fields of fire were often narrow to maintain concealment, they were sufficient to cover a 1,000-foot-wide 300 m front. Each large fortress was surrounded by layers of barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, retractable turrets, and small pillboxes. It could house 1,000 garrison troops, had diesel generators providing a month's worth of electricity, and could be resupplied with personnel at any time through underground railways and roads. Overall, the Maginot Line was a defensive system focused on killing infantry and stopping armored vehicles rather than serving as a base for counteroffensives. The distance between each turret or fortress was usually no more than 2,600 feet 800 m to create a dense, medium to close range network of fire. Strictly adhering to the lessons of trench warfare from the Western Front since the Battle of Verdun, it had poor visibility and could not deploy large-caliber artillery. Along the Rhine, the defensive walls of the semi-submerged turrets were directly exposed to enemy observation from the opposite bank, increasing their vulnerability. But the most fatal flaw was that, due to an overconfidence in its alliance with Belgium, the Franco-Belgian border had only a few casemates with built-in howitzers, and the density of anti-infantry and anti-tank obstacles was far less than that of the Alsace-Lorraine salient. The section directly facing the Ardennes forest, which Marshal Pétain deemed impassable, had almost no meaningful defenses. Most countries in Europe experienced two cycles of economic depression and recovery in the years between the two world wars. One during the Reconstruction period of the 1920s and another after the global economic crisis of 1929–1933. Unfortunately, France never experienced the second recovery. Still haunted by the shock of the franc's devaluation in the early 1920s, Paris tried to prop up its exchange rate while other nations were erecting trade barriers. As a result, both its import and export trade volumes plummeted by over 60%. To make matters worse, the political rivalry between the left-wing Popular Front coalition and the center-right reached its peak during this period. Consequently, France's industrial production capacity and military readiness fell off a cliff. During the most critical period of geopolitical change in Europe from 1935 to 1937, France's military spending, aircraft production, manufacturing capacity, and steel output all stagnated. Even when the Popular Front government uncharacteristically decided to increase the military budget in 1937, the actual military expenditure only reached 1930 levels due to a decline in total government revenue. From 1933 to 1938, France's total military spending was only $1.088 billion, less than a third of Germany's and only slightly ahead of Italy's. Even more terrifying, France's alliance system and external security environment melted away like snow in the sun, with irreversible momentum. In the 1920s, Paris's containment system against Germany was built around a military alliance with Belgium and aid to the Little Entente in southeastern Europe. But as France's financial strength dwindled, its former partners quickly began seeking new patrons. After Germany began its rearmament in 1935, the southeastern European countries rapidly grew closer to Berlin. Belgium, also fearing it would provoke Germany, declared its neutrality in 1936. This meant France could no longer preemptively enter northern Belgium to launch a preventative attack on Germany instead. The Franco-Belgian border was now at risk of being breached by the German army at the outset of war. The only ally Paris could rely on was London, but the British government was even more inclined toward appeasement than France. During the Czechoslovak crisis in 1938, it was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain who persuaded French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier to abandon France's obligations to the Czechs and fly to Munich to negotiate with Hitler. France was in full retreat. André Maginot died in 1932, before he could see his creation fully completed. 3 years later, the Saar region returned to Germany after a plebiscite, and the French could only hastily plug the gap with 3 small fortress complexes and a dozen retractable turrets. In 1936, the same year German troops marched into the Rhineland, the main northeastern section of the Maginot Line was finally declared complete. But the massive mobile force meant to complement it was never assembled. France entered the war in a state of both bewilderment and unpreparedness. On June 4, 1940, the last Allied troops holding out in northern France were evacuated by sea from Dunkirk, and the main force General Gamelin had committed to the Belgian offensive was completely lost. At this point, only 100,000 garrison troops with no field combat capability were left to defend the Eternal Line. The La Ferté fortress complex was finally captured by the Germans, becoming the first breach in the Maginot Line. By the time of the armistice on June 25th, the German army had broken through the Maginot Line in 4 places: La Ferté, the Saar, North Alsace, and Colmar. It turned out that the seemingly indestructible reinforced concrete casemates and retractable turrets, once stripped of their mobile infantry cover, could be pierced by an 88mm anti-aircraft gun firing 8 to 10 rounds continuously at a close range of 200 meters. In the encirclement southeast of Lorraine, the main body of the remaining French forces was completely surrounded by Army Group C, and the impregnable fortresses were of no help. In the end, Marshal Pétain, one of the Maginot Line's key proponents, decided to step in and clean up the mess himself. On June 22nd, General Hunziker, commander of the 4th Army Group, signed the humiliating armistice with Germany and Italy in the forest of Compiègne on behalf of the new government headed by Pétain. The territory directly governed by the French government was reduced to the southern Free Zone, just 40% of its pre-war area. The northern regions, including Paris, were occupied by the German army, and France was required to pay 400 million francs per day for occupation costs. The iron-walled Maginot Line finally fell silent. According to the Armistice Treaty, Alsace-Lorraine once again became German territory. It no longer had a border to protect.